Michael? Go ahead, sir.
I'd like to discuss some of the biological implications that you addressed. I mean, first of all, you brought up the picture of the watch, which I mean, the thing that I think you have to comprehend is that in biology, the way things get so complicated, and we have the whole DNA structure, is because we have descent with modification. And I mean, that's the way that these things become so complicated. We can't simply say, oh, we have an intelligent designer because it's so complicated.
All right, well, hold on, Michael. How do we know we have descent with modification?
It's pretty plain. I mean, we have a hierarchical structure in our brain. You can see how these things progressed over time. I mean, with simpler creatures.
Because there are simpler creatures and more complex creatures, that means that the more complex creatures have evolved from the simpler ones? Why?
Well, listen, first of all, can I ask you a question? I mean, do you believe in evolution personally? Do you believe that like a simpler creature came from a more complicated creature came from a common ancestor?
I do not believe in common ancestry. I believe in microevolution. I don't believe in macroevolution. What's your best evidence for common ancestry?
Best. Basically, well, there is evidence. I mean, you look at a virus and the way the virus can evolve. You've got a pretty simple case of...
What happens with virus? Are you talking about antibiotic resistance or a virus?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, what happens in antibiotic resistance?
Certain strains have a mutation, and then they're able to live on after the others. And then you have that go on, and then you have another strain break out, which that virus is resistant to. Then you have another common ancestor, which those all come from.
Well,
so
you're assuming what you're trying to prove. In antibiotic resistance, as you know, what happens is the reason one particular strain of a bacteria survives is because it has a mutation that allows it not to be killed by the antibiotic. So the antibiotic kills all the other bacteria, and then these few remain, and then they multiply, but they always stay bacteria. Now, when you take that antibiotic off that bacteria, what happens is the older, the original bacteria that was wiped out starts to multiply more so, because really the bacteria that wasn't wiped out initially is weaker in its ability to procreate because it has that mutation. So you don't get a linear change, you get a cyclical change. And so everything comes back to the mean. You don't get from bacteria another creature. That's never been observed in the laboratory. That's something that you are, or I should say evolutionists are implying happens, but they've never observed it. In fact, let's go to Richard Dawkins himself, because it's a good question. Richard Dawkins was asked by Philip Johnson, what's your best evidence for macroevolution? Philip Johnson's the guy that wrote Darwin on Trial, okay? And he emailed Dawkins, they've had a little discussion back and forth. Here was Dawkins' response. Best evidence for macroevolution, common ancestry. The reason we know for certain we are all related in criteria is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals. One possible interpretation of the data for a common genetic code is that what? We have common ancestor. He's right. That could be the case. What's the other possible interpretation? Common creator, common designer, right? You don't know from the data. Science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. Dawkins has already ruled out intelligent causes before he's looked at the evidence. So he's assuming by philosophical fiat that the only game in town is common ancestry rather than a common creator. He doesn't know that. He's just assuming it to be true.
I find the idea of us being more complicated not for the sake of DNA being complicated, but for the sake that it started from a simpler thing becoming more complicated, a lot more believable than the Christian belief. But I mean, I guess you'll have that. Why
is it more believable?
Because something simpler coming from, something complex coming from something simpler makes so much more sense than...
Why? Why does it?
Because everything comes from a more simple beginning. I mean, can't use an evolutionary example, so I'm just stumped.
Yeah, actually evolution, macroevolution, goes against everything we know about how everything else works. The effect cannot be greater than the cause. And in macroevolution, the effect is always greater than the cause. That's part of the problem.
I'm sorry, I'm not well equipped for this, but
Well, I appreciate it. No, here's what I want to say about this. This is more about philosophy than it is about science. We're all looking at the same evidence. The question is, how do you interpret the evidence? I go back to the beginning of the universe. There appears to be a creator and designer for the beginning of the universe. Knowing that being exists, it makes much more sense that is the same being that brought the first life into existence, right? You don't have an explanation, an atheistic explanation for the first life, do you?
yeah, the primordial soup.
The primordial soup.
Yeah.
That was brought up in 1954, and since then, there is no evidence that primordial soup ever existed on the earth. And even if it did exist, if the whole world was a primordial soup, you wouldn't even get the first protein fold before you got the first one-celled creature in 13.7 billion years.
Well, a pretty
By
long
chance.
time ago, I mean, we have big gaps in all of our records.
If you take all the resources of the universe and make it a primordial soup, in 13.7 billion years, you wouldn't even get a protein, just by chance.
Why?
Because there's not enough time and resources using natural forces alone for that to occur.
I'd like to see your evidence for that.
I'll give you a paper by Doug Axe. Come up to me afterwards, and I'll give you the reference. Thanks, Mike.